The afternoon sun glowed faintly over the quiet suburbs of Cape Town, casting a warm golden hue across the streets. Inside one of the large colonial-style houses, a young Pakistani woman named Sarah stood by the kitchen window, her eyes lost in thought. She had come to South Africa 3 years ago as a domestic worker, leaving behind her small village near Faisalabad. Every day she cooked, cleaned, and washed for her employer, Mr. Samir Khan, a wealthy businessman of mixed African and Pakistani heritage. He was tall, dark-skinned, and always carried himself with calm authority. His voice was deep, firm, yet never harsh toward her. For Sarah, life in this foreign land was both strange and lonely. She missed her mother, who struggled with old age back home, and her two younger siblings who depended on the money she sent each month. That money kept the roof of their old house from collapsing and paid her brother's school fees. Every night before sleeping, she whispered a prayer for their safety. Mr. Samir, though strict and quiet, had always treated Sarah with respect. He rarely spoke unnecessarily, but his eyes often carried a kind of sadness that Sarah could sense. His large house was quiet, too quiet. There was no laughter, no sound of children, only the ticking of clocks and the rustle of curtains in the wind. One evening, as Sarah served dinner at the dining table, she noticed that Samir looked unusually thoughtful. He sat silently for a long moment before finally speaking in a low, serious tone. "Sarah," he said, "I want to talk to you about something important." Sarah lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes, sir?" she replied softly. Samir took a deep breath, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been married twice before. Both times, things ended in sadness. I never had children. And now I'm not getting any younger." Sarah stood frozen, unsure why he was telling her this. He continued, looking directly at her. "You're a good woman, Sarah. Honest, dignified. I've seen how hard you work and how you never complain. I wish to marry you." Her heart pounded violently in her chest. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. Marry her? Her employer? A man twice her age and from a completely different world? She couldn't respond. That night, she cried silently into her pillow. Her mind replayed the words again and again. She didn't come here for this. She only came to earn enough to build a small home for her mother. Yet her heart whispered of her family's needs, the debts, her brother's future, her mother's medicine. When dawn came, she made her decision. Standing before Samir in the soft morning light, her voice trembled as she said, "If this will bring peace to my family, then I accept." Samir's eyes softened, and for the first time, he smiled gently. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly. "I promise to take care of you." That promise changed both their lives forever. A morning breeze of Cape Town carried the scent of sea salt and jacaranda flowers as Sarah stood in front of the large mirror in the guest room. She could barely recognize herself. The white dress she wore was borrowed from one of the neighbors, simple but elegant, with lace trimming around the sleeves. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the veil. Her heart felt heavy. This wasn't the kind of wedding she had imagined as a little girl. There were no songs, no family, no friends. Just a quiet ceremony in a foreign land, attended by a few witnesses from Mr. Samir's relatives and two of Sarah's fellow workers who stood by her side. Samir entered the small courtyard where the ceremony was set. He wore a light cream sherwani, and his expression was calm, yet there was a faint nervousness in his eyes. When he looked at Sarah, he didn't see a servant anymore. He saw a woman who had agreed to share his life despite all odds. As the officiant read the vows, Sarah kept her eyes lowered. Her voice shook slightly when she said, "I do." She was not marrying for love. She was marrying for survival, for the family that waited thousands of miles away. When the ceremony ended, Samir stepped closer and gently took her hand. "From today onward, you are my wife," he said softly. His tone was sincere, not demanding. "I will try to make you happy." Sarah nodded faintly, unable to find her voice. She could feel the warmth of his hand, but her heart remained distant, floating somewhere between fear and acceptance. That evening, the house was unusually quiet. The guests had left, leaving behind faint echoes of polite laughter and empty plates on the table. Sarah changed into a modest nightdress and sat by the window, staring at the pale moon. Her eyes were swollen from crying the previous night. She felt trapped, unbalanced, not by cruelty, but by fate itself. Samir walked into the room, his footsteps soft on the carpet. "I know you're not ready," he said, his voice filled with understanding. We don't need to rush. I just want you to feel safe here. His words surprised her. She had feared that night, feared what it might bring. But instead of force, there was patience. Samir left a small distance between them on the bed and said gently, "You can sleep peacefully." "I'll stay right here." Sarah turned her face away, hiding the tears that slipped down her cheeks. In that quiet moment, she realized that Samir wasn't the kind of man who used power to control. He seemed lonely, utsoan, broken in his own way. The next few days felt strange. Sarah continued her daily chores, cooking, cleaning, and arranging the garden. But now she was called Mrs. Samir. The servants greeted her differently. The neighbors whispered when she passed. Some admired her luck. Others sneered behind her back. But inside, Sarah's world remained silent. For her, it was not yet love, it was endurance. A new chapter had begun, one she didn't choose, but one. The days that followed the wedding passed slowly, filled with unfamiliar silence. Sarah still woke before sunrise, preparing breakfast and cleaning the house like before. But now, when she carried trays to the dining room, she was not a maid anymore. She was the lady of the house. Yet in her heart, she didn't feel like one. She still addressed her husband as Sir, out of habit, and he never corrected her. Mr. Samir had changed in small but noticeable ways. He no longer left for work without a word. Each morning, he paused by the table, glanced at her, and offered a small smile before leaving. When he returned in the evenings, he brought fruits or small gifts, a silk scarf, a pair of sandals, sometimes even a book about Pakistan. "You might miss home," he said once as he handed her a packet of dried mango slices imported from Karachi. She thanked him softly, her voice barely above a whisper. One evening, while Sarah was washing dishes in the backyard, she heard the faint hum of his voice. Samir was repairing an old bench near the garden, his sleeves rolled up, a quiet determination on his face. The sunset painted his skin in shades of amber and gold. For the first time, Sarah noticed the lines of exhaustion on his face, the marks of someone who had seen too much of life and carried too many disappointments. Later that night, while serving tea, she gathered the courage to ask, "Do you ever miss your family, sir?" Samir looked surprised. Then he sighed, his eyes turning distant. "I used to," he said softly. "But I think I stopped expecting love from people a long time ago." Sarah didn't respond. She lowered her gaze, feeling a strange ache in her chest. That night, as she lay in bed beside him, she thought about loneliness, the kind that makes even a big house feel empty. Gradually, their routine began to shift. Samir started joining her in small chores, chopping vegetables, carrying buckets of water, or even hanging the laundry. The neighbors would sometimes peek through their fences, whispering about how odd it looked, a wealthy man helping his young wife with housework. But Samir never cared. "It's our home," he said. "We share it." Sarah began to feel lighter. When Samir laughed, she found herself smiling too. The fear that once clung to her heart started to loosen. Still, she could sense the judgment around her. When she went to the local market, she often heard murmurs. "That Pakistani woman married her boss," someone would whisper. "She must have done it for money." Sarah pretended not to hear, but the words burned. That evening, when Samir noticed her quietness, he said gently, "Don't mind them, Sarah. They don't know your heart. I do." Those simple words reached deep into her soul. For the first time since she arrived in South Africa, Sarah felt something unfamiliar, respect. And perhaps, hidden somewhere beneath it, the faint beginning of love. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of life in the quiet Cape Town house began to change. The cold walls that once echoed loneliness started to hold laughter, even if soft and rare. Sarah no longer walked with her head always lowered. Sometimes she hummed while cooking, her voice barely audible but enough to make Samir pause and listen from his study. He found comfort in those faint melodies that drifted through the hallways like sunlight sneaking through dusty windows. One morning, while Sarah was preparing parathas in the kitchen, Samir entered quietly. The smell of fresh dough and sizzling butter filled the air. He stood by the counter, watching her roll the dough with delicate hands. "You remind me of home when you cook," he said with a small smile. She turned in surprise, almost embarrassed. "I'm sorry if it's too oily, sir." Samir chuckled. "Don't call me sir anymore." "You're my wife, Sarah." Her cheeks flushed slightly. The word wife sounded heavy in her ears, still strange, yet somehow softer than before. I'll try, she replied shyly. From that day onward, their conversations began to stretch longer. Over dinner, they talked about their childhoods. Samir told her about growing up near Durban with a strict father who rarely smiled, and Sarah spoke about her village in Punjab, where her mother used to braid her hair every morning before school. Sometimes they laughed at each other's stories. Sometimes they sat in silence, simply content with the company. One evening, as rain poured outside, the power went out. The house was wrapped in darkness except for a single candle flickering on the table. Samir found Sarah sitting by the window, staring into the wet garden. "You look worried," he said gently. "I was just thinking," she replied, "how everything in life changes without asking. One day, I was working in a stranger's house, and now I live here as a wife. Sometimes, I still don't know if I made the right choice." Samir sat beside her, his voice calm but full of honesty. "Maybe none of us ever know right away. But I can tell you this, since you came into my life, this house finally feels alive again." Those words hit her heart like warm rain. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Then softly she said, "I never wanted luxury, Samir. I just wanted peace, Abbas." He looked at her then, not as an employer, not even as a husband bound by a promise, but as a man seeing the first light after years of night. "Then let's build peace together," he said quietly. That night, when they prayed before sleeping, their hands brushed by accident. Neither of them pulled away. It was a simple moment, yet it carried the weight of a new beginning, an unspoken understanding that love was not forced or demanded, but slowly earned through kindness, patience, and shared silence. In that candlelit room, Sarah finally felt something she hadn't, in years, home. It happened on a bright Sunday morning. Sarah woke up feeling dizzy and weak, her stomach turning with nausea. She thought it was nothing, perhaps fatigue from the previous day when she had prepared food for Samir's business guests. But as the hours passed, the feeling only grew stronger. Samir noticed her pale face as she struggled to finish breakfast. "Sarah, you don't look well," he said, concern etching his features. "You should rest." "I'm fine," she insisted softly, though her trembling hands betrayed her. When the weakness persisted, Samir called a doctor despite her hesitation. By afternoon, a kind South African female doctor arrived with her medical bag and a reassuring smile. After a brief examination, she looked at Sarah and said gently, "Congratulations, Mrs. Khan. You're expecting?" For a moment, time froze. The doctor's words seemed unreal. Sarah's eyes widened, her lips parted, but no sound came out. "Pregnant?" she whispered. "Yes," the doctor confirmed, smiling warmly. "It's still early, around a month." Samir stood in stunned silence, his heart pounding. Slowly, his eyes softened, filling with tears he didn't try to hide. "Sarah," he said in a trembling voice, "we're going to have a child." Sarah covered her face with both hands as tears of disbelief rolled down her cheeks. All the nights of uncertainty, the fear, the loneliness, it all came rushing back, now mingled with an overwhelming feeling of gratitude. Samir stepped closer, his voice breaking as he whispered, "God has finally blessed us. You have no idea what this means to me." That day marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Samir became even more attentive than before. He refused to let Sarah lift anything heavy or work for long hours. Every evening, he would sit beside her with a tray of fruits, insisting she eat properly. "I don't want you to tire yourself," he would say while tucking a pillow behind her back. But with joy came whispers from outside. Some of Samir's relatives began visiting the house, their smiles fake, their words dripping with arrogance. "So the child of our family will come from a maid?" one of his brothers muttered. Sarah heard their cruel remarks from behind the door, her heart breaking silently. She wanted to disappear, to spare Samir from the ridicule, but when he learned of it, his face darkened with anger. Standing before his family, he said firmly, "She is my wife, my blessing." Without her, I would never have known peace that night. As they sat together, Sarah wept softly. "I don't want to be the reason you fight with them," she whispered. Samir reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "You are not a reason to fight," he said gently. "You are the reason I now believe in life again." Under the calm African night, with the moon shining over their home, Sarah placed her hand on her stomach and whispered a quiet prayer. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. She was a wife, a mother-to-be, and the beating of a tiny heart inside her became the rhythm of hope. The news of Sarah's pregnancy spread quickly among the neighbors and Samir's relatives. At first, it seemed like joy had entered every corner of their lives. The quiet house now echoed with laughter. New clothes were bought, and Samir often came home early just to talk to the child growing inside her. But behind that happiness, whispers began to grow louder in the streets and among family circles. At the local market, Sarah could feel eyes following her wherever she went. Some women smiled politely, while others murmured words sharp enough to wound. "Look at her," one woman said in a low voice, pretending to adjust her scarf. "The maid who turned into a madam," another replied mockingly. "She's clever, that one. Found herself a rich man and now she'll live like a queen." Sarah tried to ignore them, clutching the shopping bag close to her chest. But when she returned home, the tears she had held back finally fell. Samir found her sitting in the kitchen, staring at the floor. "Who hurt you?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "It's nothing. People just talk." Samir knelt beside her, lifting her chin gently. "Let them talk. You have nothing to prove to anyone. You're my wife, and soon, the mother of my child. That's all that matters." Those words soothed her heart, yet deep down she still battled the weight of being seen as an outsider, a foreign woman in a country where she didn't belong, in a marriage that many didn't accept. At night, she would lie awake, listening to the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan and the soft breathing of her husband beside her. Her hand would rest on her stomach as she whispered, "Please, God, protect my child. Let him be born into kindness, not cruelty." Samir's love became her armor. He was no longer the distant employer she had once feared. Now he cooked for her when she was too tired to stand, learned Urdu phrases from her just to make her smile, and sometimes read aloud from a book of prayers, his voice deep and steady. "I used to think love was just about desire," he told her one night, "but now I know it's about care, patience, and forgiveness." Despite the judgment around them, their bond grew stronger. Sarah began to laugh again. She would sit in the garden knitting tiny clothes, and Samir would join her with a cup of tea. They often talked about what to name the baby. "If it's a boy, I want to call him Aman," she said one evening. "It means peace." Samir smiled. "Then peace he shall bring to our lives." But beneath the surface, Sarah knew challenges still awaited. The same relatives who mocked her had now begun to plot quietly, hoping to isolate her from Samir once the child was born. Still, when Sarah placed her hand on her growing belly and felt the faint flutter of life, her fear faded for a while. She was no longer the frightened girl who had once cried herself to sleep in a stranger's house. She was a woman, stronger, wiser, and ready to fight for her child's future. As Sarah's belly grew rounder, the calm that once filled the house began to tremble under quiet tension. Samir's relatives, who had stayed silent for months, now started visiting more often, each with a false smile and a hidden agenda. His eldest sister, Nazreen, was the first to show her disapproval openly. She arrived one afternoon, her perfume strong and her tone sharper than usual. "So," she said while glancing around the house, "this is how things are now? Our brother's wife is a former servant?" Her words dripped with disdain. Sarah stood near the doorway, unsure whether to respond. Samir, who had been reading in the living room, rose calmly. "Yes, Nasreen. She is my wife, and soon the mother of my child. Please show respect." Nasreen laughed bitterly. "Respect? You've brought shame on our name. Father would never have allowed this. Father is gone," Samir replied quietly but firmly. "And if he were alive, he would have understood my heart better than you do." The air turned heavy. Nasreen muttered something under her breath and left, her heels clicking like thunder against the marble floor. Sarah felt her knees weaken. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears forming. "Because of me, your family—" Samir stopped her. "No, Sarah. Because of you, I've finally learned what family truly means." Despite his reassurance, the visits continued, some subtle, others venomous. One cousin even dared to suggest that Samir should prepare a separate house for Sarah, so the child wouldn't carry confusion about his place in the family. Samir's patience began to crack. "If anyone insults my wife again," he warned, "they will no longer be welcome here." That night, as the rain lashed against the windows, Sarah felt the weight of guilt pressing against her chest. She lay awake beside her husband, listening to the thunder outside and the faint movement of life inside her. Samir, she whispered, what if our child grows up hearing these things? What if he feels unwanted? Samir reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. Then he'll grow up knowing that his parents fought the world for him, he said softly. And that's all he'll need to feel loved. Sarah wept quietly, pressing her face against his shoulder. She had never felt such protection before, never known love that wasn't demanding or cruel. In the following weeks, Samir arranged everything for the baby's arrival. He painted a small room near their bedroom in soft yellow tones and built a crib with his own hands. I want our child to open his eyes to something I made myself, he told her with pride. Sarah watched him work, her heart swelling with emotion. But the closer her delivery date came, the more her fears returned. Strange messages began arriving at their door, anonymous notes saying cruel things like, "You'll never belong here." Samir burned them one by one without letting her read them. He smiled for her sake, but in his eyes lingered the shadow of worry. Outside, the storm clouds gathered again, both in the sky and in their lives, warning that the hardest test was yet to come. The evening sky over Cape Town burned crimson before a storm rolled in from the sea. Winds howled through the streets, rattling the windows of the Khan residence. Sarah, now 8 months pregnant, stood by the window, her hands on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. Samir had been unusually quiet all day, his mind weighed down by tension. The anonymous letters, the gossip, the hostility, all of it haunted him. Yet when he looked at Sarah, all he saw was courage. That night, as thunder rumbled across the sky, Sarah suddenly felt a sharp pain twist through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the edge of the table for support. "Samir!" she cried out. Within seconds, he was by her side, his face pale with panic. "It's time," she whispered, her voice trembling. Rain poured furiously outside, flooding the narrow streets. Samir wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and helped her to the car. The wind was so strong it nearly tore the umbrella from his hand. "Hold on, Sarah," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "You're going to be fine." The drive to the hospital felt endless. The wipers struggled against the downpour, lightning flashing across the sky like angry fire. Sarah groaned in pain, clutching his arm tightly. "I'm scared," she gasped between contractions. Samir took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're the strongest woman I know," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Just breathe, Sarah. Please, keep breathing." By the time they reached the hospital, nurses rushed them inside. Samir refused to leave her side, pacing outside the delivery room as doctors moved quickly around her. The sound of her cries tore through his heart. He prayed silently, his hands trembling. "God," he whispered, "don't take her from me." Not after everything, hours passed like an eternity. Every minute felt like a blade cutting deeper into his fear. Then suddenly, a sound broke through the chaos, the soft, high cry of a newborn child. Samir froze, his lips parted, his eyes filling with tears before he even saw the baby. A nurse stepped out, smiling beneath her mask. "Congratulations, Mr. Khan," she said warmly. "It's a boy." Samir's knees nearly gave way. He entered the room and saw Sarah lying weak but smiling, her eyes wet with tears. In her arms rested a small, brown-skinned baby wrapped in a white blanket. The boy's tiny fingers curled around his mother's thumb. "He's beautiful," Samir whispered, his voice breaking. He leaned down, kissing Sarah's forehead. "You did it." Sarah looked at him, her face glowing despite the exhaustion. "We did it," she corrected softly. In that stormy night between thunder and tears, love had triumphed over every shadow that had tried to destroy it. The little cries of their son filled the sterile room with warmth. Outside, the storm began to fade, the first hint of dawn creeping over the horizon, a promise of peace after the storm. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, turning the sterile room into a soft golden haven. Sarah lay propped up on the bed, gazing at the tiny miracle sleeping peacefully in her arms. The baby's skin glowed warm brown under the sunlight, his lips moving slightly as though he were dreaming. Samir stood beside her, his eyes never leaving their son. Every few seconds, he reached out to touch the baby's small fingers, as if to make sure this wasn't all a dream. When the nurse entered to check on them, she smiled. "He's a strong one," she said. You should be proud." "We are," Samir replied, his voice thick with emotion. As the nurse left, he turned to Sarah and whispered, "I never thought I'd live to see this day. God has finally given me everything I ever prayed for." Sarah smiled weakly, her hand resting over his. "He gave us each other first." The rest followed. 3 days later, they returned home. The grand house that once echoed with silence was now alive with the laughter and soft cries of a newborn. Samir carried the baby carefully into the nursery he had painted himself, a small room decorated in gentle yellow and white. "Welcome home, my son," he said, his voice trembling with joy. Sarah stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes. The once lonely house now felt like a sanctuary. Every corner seemed to breathe again. Even the housemaids, who had once whispered behind her back, looked at her differently now, with respect, even admiration. But peace didn't come without challenges. Word spread quickly through the community, and soon relatives and neighbors began arriving to see the baby. Some came with genuine blessings, others with concealed envy. Nasreen, Samir's sister, came last. She stood at the doorway, hesitating, her pride battling her guilt. The sight of the child, small, fragile, and pure, softened her expression. "He looks like you," she said quietly. "Maybe," Samir replied, "but his heart, I hope, will be like his mother's." Nasreen looked at Sarah, who offered her a tired but genuine smile. The tension that had once filled the space between them seemed to dissolve. Nasreen stepped forward and gently touched the baby's hand. "May he live a long and happy life," she murmured before leaving without another word. That night, as the rain whispered softly outside, Samir sat beside Sarah, holding the baby close. "Do you know what I've realized?" he said. "It wasn't wealth or status that made this house empty. It was the absence of love. You brought it back." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "And you taught me what love truly means: patience, kindness, and faith." They sat together in the soft glow of the lamp, their baby nestled safely between them. Outside, the African night hummed with distant sounds of life. Inside, peace finally rested upon their home. For the first time in years, Samir didn't feel alone. For the first time ever, Sarah felt like she truly belonged. Their journey had begun with uncertainty and fear, but it had blossomed into something far greater, a love born not from desire, but from destiny. Years passed gently over the Khan household, like the slow unfolding of dawn after a long night. The baby who had once fit in the palm of Samir's hand was now a lively little boy named Aman, with curious eyes and an infectious laugh that filled every corner of the home. His presence had transformed their world. The once quiet halls now echoed with running footsteps, toys clattering across the floor, and the occasional giggle that made even the sternest days feel light. Sarah often stood in the garden watching Aman play among the jacaranda trees, their purple petals falling around him like blessings.